Сбили с ноги дам бави горало. Ой, цвагулим зияни дарало. Ласковец мост давар слави горало.
My name is Brian Gigantino, and welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. Right now, war is raging in Ukraine. After the initial shock of Russia's invasion settled into what looks like a new normal without a clear end in sight, we here at Reimagining Soviet Georgia thought long and hard about how to respond, or if we should even respond at all. We didn't want to provide a knee-jerk reaction and say the first thing that came to our minds without thinking the situation through. Instead, we felt it was better to use our platform to try and have a productive discussion on the war in Ukraine and what it means for Georgia. At first, we didn't even know how to approach a conversation like that. But then, it quickly became clear. After Russia's invasion on February 24th, 2022, many journalists and pundits contextualized the fighting by mentioning Georgia and that country's 2008 war, placing the conflict as one causal event on a timeline. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, so of course they invaded Ukraine in 2022. But what is troubling about these comparisons is that with them, events lose their historical texture in service of shallow and comfortable analysis. Though of course understandable given what is happening, it is a mistake and a dangerous one. If we want to properly understand what is going on in Ukraine and how events since the collapse of the Soviet Union got us here, we have to face history as it was. Not a sanitized version to uphold political purity or righteousness, but rather how the contingent events within systems and relations at the local, regional, and global levels managed to push, politicize, and radicalize actors in directions that were not necessarily predetermined. If we do not consider the recent past with such delicate attention, then we are doomed to forego our ability to navigate our way out of the present we are currently living through. To have this conversation, myself, Sopo Japaridze, and Becca Natslishvili invited Gerard Toll onto the podcast. His 2016 book, Near Abroad, Putin, the West, and the Contest over Ukraine and the Caucasus could not be more relevant.
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Gerard Toll. I am a professor of government and international affairs at Virginia Tech's program in the greater Washington, D.C. area. And I've been a professor for 30 plus years. My focus is on territorial conflicts after communism and their intersection with geopolitical competition. I've written works on the theory of geopolitics. A book called Critical Geopolitics came out in 1996, and then subsequently a book on Bosnia, where I went to Bosnia with a former student of mine, and we did research on the process of ethnic cleansing and then the effort by the international community to get people to go back to their homes. And that book came out in 2011. It was called Bosnia Remade: Ethnic Cleansing and Its Reversal. And then subsequently, I have done research in all of the post-Soviet de facto states, with the exception of the new ones that were created in the Donbass. So I haven't been on the ground there, but I have been on the ground in all the others, including South Ossetia. And I have helped organize, along with my colleagues, public opinion research there. And in 2017, I published the book Near Abroad, with the title that the publishers gave me, and I sometimes forget exactly, but it's essentially Putin, the West, and the contest over Ukraine and the Caucasus. And apologies to Georgia, because the publishers said that Georgia probably would be confusing to people in the titles. So it was the Caucasus, and apologies also to those folks in Armenia and Azerbaijan who were hoping to get some consideration of Karabakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. I've done research on that, but it's not in this book. So that's who I am. Oh, also I'm yeah, it's pretty important. Probably I'm an Irish citizen. I grew up on the border between Northern Ireland and the South in the late 60s, 1970s, the time of the Troubles. And so that was geographic determinism in shaping my interest in so-called ethnic conflict, basically in territorial conflicts. And then I came to the United States in 1982 as a graduate student and stayed.
Great. So why don't you just give us a little outline? What was the 2008 Russo-Georgian War, sometimes called the August War?
So the 2008 war was an interstate and an intrastate war between Georgia, the state of Georgia, separatists within Georgia, in the two regions, as you know, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and the Russian Federation. It's often rendered as the Russo-Georgian War, but it really should be the Georgian-Ossetian-Russian War. There is a third level, or an in-between level, which is the Ossetian forces that were based in Skin Valley and that saw themselves as independent of Georgia and aspired to be independent of Georgia. In terms of comparing August 2008 and 2000, the horror that's going on in Ukraine right now, there are certainly continuities. There's continuities in terms of Russia's behavior and geopolitical practice. For the sort of central aspect, Russia's quest for security as it sees it in the near abroad. You have the instrumentalization of territorial separatism within Ukraine. I think that and this is a difference between Georgia and Ukraine, is that the territorial separatism that you have in the Donbass is something that was very much incubated by the Russian state after 2014, whereas the territorial separatism in Georgia and Abkhazia has a long history to it. Another obvious continuity is the willingness to use force and flirting with regime change, and of course it's much more apparent in Ukraine. Tolerance of what are war crimes by proxies and its own forces. We haven't mentioned the fact that, you know, the proxy forces, or the forces that came from Chechnya, the militias, you know, did engage in war crimes after the war was over in attacking Georgian villages in Georgia proper, beyond South Ossetia. So there's a whole sort of legacy that needs to be acknowledged and recognized. And then the framing of Russia's actions in terms of a broader civilizational struggle against genocide, Western unipolarity and dominance. But I do think there's also really important differences. Ukraine matters a lot more than Georgia to Russia's security. both Georgia and Ukraine, of course, are intimately connected to Russia and its history. But Ukraine and the Ukrainian state is tied to Kievan Rus and to Orthodox identity in a way that I think is very, very distinctive and worth noticing. Secondly, the scale of the conflict is just so much greater in Ukraine right now. And I think it's an important point is that, the war in Ukraine is much further along the radicalization scale than it was in 2008. So the suspicion, the mistrust, the hatred is now deeper. There's, arms control regimes have been gutted. There's more intense forms of conspiracism with the Ukraine crisis. Russia is further along in terms of its own idea of the Russian world, its self-constructed notion of the Russian world. And it's more simply than a geopolitical construct, this idea of Ruski Mir. It's a self-isolating informational bubble that Russia is in right now. And then, fifthly, there's talk of nuclear weapons, much more commonplace now. So this crisis is, to me, it's the most dangerous crisis in my lifetime and the lifetime of a lot of people. And so that needs to be borne in mind. We're dealing with a more radicalized Vladimir Putin. And of course, one stage in his further radicalization was the 2008 war. So, we need to keep that in mind. But what is going on in Ukraine right now is just abominable. And it is only right and proper that we have solidarity with the Ukrainian state, the Ukrainian people that are fighting against this invasion.
Do you think the main demands, first, what are the main demands of Russia? And do you think if those were conceded, that Putin would stop? Or what would happen? I'm also confused how to end, how the end of this war would look like. I'm having a hard time also just imagining it at this point. I don't even know. For me, I think this is a radical reconfiguration of the entire European and Western sort of security system and balance of power. So I don't think it's just now the war is going to end. This is it has moved beyond Ukraine,
Yeah, no, it is. It's an extremely serious conflict. It is upended European security structures. It has radically changed the relationship of Russia to the international community, Russia's place in the global economy. I mean, the implications, the after effects of this are going to be with us for a long, long time. How does this end? I hope it doesn't end in further escalation, but it really has the potential to escalate as NATO states bordering Ukraine seek to provide support and weapons and training and maybe, fighter jets. And then there's this international brigade of soldiers that may be going into Ukraine. All of that involves NATO in the conflict in an indirect manner, but nevertheless, NATO's not neutral here. So there is considerable potential for escalation. I think that there is the possibility for a solution, which would be to declare Ukraine neutral geopolitically. I think that's going to be extremely hard for people to swallow now because of the radicalization that has occurred as a result of this war. But I think it's also justified to stop the war. And here I would, I guess, address a paradox as I see it, and that is that in one sense, we all have an interest in not backing Vladimir Putin into a corner and giving him a win in inverted commas in order to defeat him in the long term. Is that Ukraine needs peace, needs non-violence in order for it to then begin to get back on its feet. But what form that will take, I don't know. I do know from my research in Ukraine that this was never going to work, that they were never going to be able to set up a puppet regime which is going to have popular legitimacy beyond a few areas in the southeast. And they have completely blown that now with the shelling of Mariupol. Mariupol was a place where there was considerable sympathy for Russian narratives and the like. The violence has transformed that. So let's get a peace, some kind of a peace. If it means declaring that Ukraine will become neutral, fine for now. If it means that Ukraine has to recognize the annexation of Crimea, hard compromise, but it has to be done in order for us to get to the next stage, which is to try to help a Ukrainian state and Ukrainian people begin to put together their lives. And what we don't want is Ukraine to turn into Afghanistan, because that no one wins in that circumstances. But certainly Ukrainians are at the crux of an awful, awful geopolitical struggle, which would be a grinder in terms of their lives, their homes, their economy. That's just their cities. It's just awful.
Why is it that, say, Georgia has a right to independence, but Ossetians don't seem to have a right to independence? Why is there this double standard of some people can have independence and some have to be absorbed into a larger? It's a constant theme, that there is different kinds of rules for different players,
There's a threshold issue in political geography, and also the degree to which a community defines itself as a nation. But if it defines itself as a nation, then there's an aspiration to create a state. Particular nationalism is the seeking of a state which will be representative of the nation, which will sort of give political voice to the nation. But with smaller nations, and there are many of them, as you know, within the Soviet Union, it was always a question as to what degree of political power they would have, and whether they could acquire statehood in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And under international law, the Iti-Poseiditis doctrine, it effectively granted sovereignty, or the ability to have a sovereign entity to the post-Soviet republics, and not to the entities within the post-Soviet republics. South Ossetia was at an even lower level than Adjara and Abkhazia, as you know, and not being a Soviet republic. It was an autonomous district. Now, in terms of the different rights, it actually is the case that South Ossetians sought to upgrade their status to become a Soviet republic within Georgia, but within Soviet Georgia, but that was denied. They passed a law in essentially seeking to do this unilaterally, and that was in part one of the one of the reasons why you got a spiral, which led to violence and was one of the origins of the conflict, the 2008 war. Now, just on the issue of the right to independence, one of the things that you need to know about South Ossetia is that you have this paradox. South Ossetia today sees itself as a state, a Republic of South Ossetia. It is, people are invested in that statehood. There is a whole iconography associated with that statehood. But if you ask people in South Ossetia what they want for their political status, and remember, there's not that many people in South Ossetia relative to the number of people that lived there in Soviet times. The population is probably just a third, or maybe even less, maybe only a quarter. So in Soviet times, it was well over 100,000. It is probably only about the order of 30,000 or so today. But if you ask them, their aspiration is to be united with North Ossetia and to be part of Russia. So, and this is something we also see in the Donbass too, is that although the Donbass is, is a very complex situation, but in some of the surveys, not all of them, but some of the surveys, we find that the aspiration is to join Russia. So independence is not an option that is popular. So in effect, what for a small nation, at least in the case of the Ossetians, they want to be part of a larger entity, a larger state, and they feel that they're going to be better protected because of the history of violence by being united with their ethnic kin in North Ossetia.
It depends also how we define the nation. Do we define the nation as a cultural unity, or do we define the nation as a political or civil unity? So if we define the nation as a civil unity, which is a modern understanding of nation, then we have to consider, maybe I'm a little bit biased in the sense because I'm Georgian, but anyway, we have to consider that in Abkhazia and also in South Ossetia, not much as in Abkhazia, but also in South Ossetia, the balance of population was not in favor of Georgian, but the Georgian made a big part of the population before the tension which we had in South Ossetia. Because even we have not such a number of refugees from South Ossetia like from Abkhazia, but a lot of people left South Ossetia also in the beginnings of 90s. So as a civil or political unity, South Ossetia could not come true anyway. So because there was no such understanding of whole community which used to live on this on this secessionist territory. And the second, I agree with you totally that you say that the aspiration of South Ossetia was not so much the independence, but it was more dictated from irredentism, like, to join more Russia and as a part of Russia, which is called Ossetian Republic at the moment. So it was more irredentism as the attempt to create their own nation state.
Yeah, I think that that's an important point, Becca, that when I am doing research on public opinion in these sort of post-Soviet de facto states, separatist territories, you have to bear in mind the fact that, yeah, these are territories that suffered considerable forced displacement of the population. Abkhazia is probably the best example of that, but you're also correct. There was significant forced displacement of Georgians from ethnic Georgians from South Ossetia. But the larger context is the political turmoil in Georgia from 1989 through 1992. And you actually had more Ossetians, about 100,000 Ossetians living outside of South Ossetia in Georgia, many of whom were displaced from their homes within Georgia, in Tbilisi and elsewhere, and therefore some of them fled to South Ossetia for protection, and quite a number of them ended up in North Ossetia. So there's a community of Georgians, or sort of ethnic Ossetian Georgians in North Ossetia that have a bitter experience of memory and displacement. And so that's part of the context too. In the case of Abkhazia, well, Abkhazia is very, very interesting because of the fact that the population there was pretty much evenly divided between Georgian and non-Georgian. So the population in 1989, 1990. And when you had the intervention, the disastrous intervention in Georgia, and the eruption of the violence there, that then triggered the war, the War of Independence, as far as the ethnic Abkhaz are concerned. They built an alliance with the ethnic Armenians and ethnic Russians that were living in Abkhazia. And the upshot of all of that, of course, was absolutely horrific displacement of the Georgian population in there. You know, it was a crime that happened, but that happened within the context of war, and it happened within the context of earlier displacement of non-Georgians, and so therefore there was a sort of revenge factor. It was a really nasty civil war that was occurring there. But the upshot of it is, therefore, that when you're doing public opinion research in Abkhazia today, you're only capturing a certain segment of the Georgian population. That it's essentially the ethnic Georgians that are still in the Gali district, so many others are displaced, of course. And actually, in my research, I wrote an article which contrasted the attitudes of people who had been displaced from Abkhazia along with the attitudes of people who remained in Abkhazia. And it was like two different worlds, and they were, very irreconcilable attitudes towards return, for example, in Abkhazia.
I think a lot of the ways that the Georgian 2008 war is being narrativized or brought up now in light of the current Ukraine war that's going on, I think some things need to be clarified. And in particular, I'd like to start with, at the beginning of our conversation, you mentioned that it's normally called the Russo-Georgian War, but in fact, maybe a better term for it would be the Russo-Ossetian Georgian War. And so I'm wondering if you could just, talk about this dynamic between what I would call the larger actors and the smaller actors, because it seems like sometimes these things get confused. For example, in today's conflict in Ukraine, in the news, they're often talking about, it's often narrativized as this is a conflict between Russia and the West, And then that is it's a very vague framework, right? Because of course the West has the United States, the EU, you've got even Ukraine's military, right? And then you've got Russia, you've got these separatist regions, so these various actors. So in terms of the 2008 conflict, very often when it's brought up in relation to Ukraine, they'll say, well, as you can see, Russia invaded Georgia in 2008. And of course, now they're invading Ukraine. And so I'm wondering if you could just touch on, where does that kind of obfuscate the reality of the dynamics that were happening in 2008 between these actors, between the Ossetian locals, the Georgians, the United States' relationship with Georgia, the interests of the West, and the interests of the Russian Federation. Because to me, that nuance is so important for making sense of why the 2008 war happened.
Sure. Yeah. Well, you will know that in Near Abroad, I try to make an argument for what I call thick geopolitics. And thick geopolitics is a form of geopolitics that takes into consideration all of the different actors and the different scales at which we're talking about. I mean, the South Ossetian War could have been just another quote unquote village skirmish in the Caucasus that was not on international newspapers, that was not a major deal. And God knows there are lots of those across the world today. But it wasn't that, because the parties to it had an incentive to sort of appeal to their patrons higher up the scale. And so in effect, this became geopoliticized. And when I say geopoliticized, I have something very precise in mind, and that is that a conflict that is local or national gets framed within larger global great power competition and conflict. Now, as you well know, the origins of the 2008 war are in the Soviet collapse and the chaos that engulfed Soviet Georgia as the Soviet Union collapsed. So secessionist revolts, collapse of the Soviet power structure, as I talked about, the rise of ethno-nationalist forces, non-state militias, and then civil war. But what was really crucial was how Georgia, after it became stabilized under Shevardnadze, began to undertake a drive to join NATO. And it wanted to join NATO for understandable reasons. It wanted to acquire security structures for itself and to strengthen itself sufficiently to take back the territories it controlled by separatists. So in one sense, the agenda of joining NATO was also to strengthen the state and to be more powerful in dealing with these national separatist questions. So there was a very much an agenda there. But these separatists were not created by Moscow. They're initially not supported by Moscow. And in fact, they were boycotted by Moscow. There was a boycott against Abkhazia because Moscow was not in favor of separatism in the Caucasus for very understandable reasons, because of Chechnya and because of the North Caucasus. But they began to acquire greater and greater support from Moscow as Georgia sought to move closer to Euro-Atlantic institutions. And as you well know, the war was preceded by a series of radicalizing geopolitical moves. So in February 2008, Kosovo unilaterally declared itself an independent state, and the United States led a group of Western states in recognizing it as such. And this was radical in that the US was endorsing a unilateral act by secessionists in contravention of international law on state sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, of course, in practice, there is a clash in international law between state sovereignty and the right of people to claim self-determination. But in response, the Duma called on the Kremlin to recognize Abkhazia and South Ossetia as independent states. So these conflicts, which had their own local dynamics, began to be framed within these larger geopolitical struggles. And then, you have the history of Putin telling Saakashvili, because they met very soon after that unilateral declaration of independence by Kosovo, telling him in a meeting in Moscow that payback was coming and he's going to be part of it. And in April, then you had further radicalization of the situation after a NATO heads of state meeting in Bucharest issued a declaration that stated that it was not approving a membership action plan for either Georgia or Ukraine, but and there was that famous line in the declaration: NATO welcomes Ukraine and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO. And that's when the conflict, which was simmering, really began to flare up. So what you have is the geopoliticization of territorial conflicts within Georgia. It did not need to be that way. But that's part of the tragedy of the conflict, because each side saw it in its own interest to do so. And, including the separatists in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, who are big supporters of Georgia joining NATO, because therefore that makes them very important instruments for Russia to counter that. And then that helps bring Russia, that may have been ambivalent about their own separatism, very firmly on their side, and to instrumentalize them and use them and use these particular conflicts as territorial levers to try to influence the geopolitical aspirations and orientations of the state of Georgia.
Do you mean that the recognition of these regions, in the sense, because you mentioned it before, was a clever decision, or was the right decision from the point of view of Russia, rational decision?
So which recognition are you talking about? The ones in
late
August?
Yes,
so late August 2008 as a consequence of the...
Yes.
So was that rational in terms of what was previously the policy of the Russian government? Is that the question you're asking me?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So I think that that's a very important moment when you have a public rupture in the previous position of the Russian Federation towards secessionism. It did not recognize Kosovo's declaration of independence. It was strongly against separatism. It recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia as part of Georgia until that particular moment. And I think that was debated considerably from what we know. And it was a decision that I think personally Putin supported. And the reason is that this was seen as a sort of punitive policy response to the August War. That war was one that featured a lot of emotion on the part of Putin towards Saakashvili. I mean, you will recall the famous statement he made to Sarkozy in Moscow, that he wanted to string Saakashvili up by the balls, just like they did to Saddam Hussein. So he was thinking in terms of regime change. He was thinking in terms of the 2003 war, the Iraq war. And so therefore, there was an emotional rationality to it, but this is not necessarily the same as the rationality of a card player or someone who is just thinking in cooler terms about what is best.
Was the war avoidable or not? In your point of view, from Georgian side?
On top of Becca's question about was the war avoidable, similarly, every year when this war is brought up, and especially now, there's the question of, did Georgia start the war? And this, and of course, every time that this question gets brought up, the Tagliavini report is also brought up as a justification, or people say that no, this was biased against Georgia. So just to add to Becca's question, was the war avoidable? And also this question of, did Georgia start the war? And what is the relevance of this independent international fact-finding mission, the Tagliavini report, that said that Georgia did?
Yes, so I think we need to be very clear about what we mean when we use the term war, because this was an ongoing, simmering conflict which had a low intensity violence associated with it prior to August 7th and August 8th, the morning of August 8th. So did Georgia start the war? Georgia started, the Saakashvili government started a significant escalation of the conflict. But prior to that, the conflict was already on an escalation ladder, and there were a number of sort of steps up that ladder in that summer. So there was a larger kind of structural set of circumstances which were pointing towards increasing levels of violence. Now, was the war avoidable? I do think it was avoidable. I think it was very, very clear that the Russian state was invested in keeping in power the de facto states in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. The Russians, after all, did shoot down a drone over Abkhazia in the summer. They indicated a number of times that they wanted a no use of force pledge. That was front and center in their diplomacy. It was very clear that if Georgia used force, it was going to get a response from the Russian state. And so therefore, I think that was reckless to ever think that that Georgia could win in that circumstances. Now, there's a lot of things we don't know about the August War and the particular archives. It'll be quite a while before those archives are open and we understand the decision-making process in the Kremlin and at the lower levels, and also even within the Georgian state. But I think that there is various explanations as to why Saakashvili decided to escalate in the way that he did. And one is that it was an emotional decision in response to the deaths earlier that day of a number of Georgian troops in South Ossetia. The Georgian enclave was being shelled. But that shelling, of course, was because the Georgian forces within South Ossetia were engaged in violence of their own and had engaged in violence prior to that. And so it did look as if war was coming. And so you need two sides in order to continue to escalate. The choice that Georgia had, which is not an easy choice, would be to refuse to escalate. That's what the US, from the research I have been able to do, that was what the US was saying. That's what Condi Rice was saying. That's what the Polish foreign minister was saying, and others were saying, do not do this. Karl Bildt met with Saakashvili at the Bucharest summit and talks about it. Ron Asmus talks about that meeting in his book, where he says that he became very concerned that Saakashvili was really intent on war. And remember, Saakashvili had built up the Georgian forces at that time. Almost about 9% of Georgian GDP was going to the defense. And so Georgian defense spending peaked in 2007. So there was a lot of money going to kit and to force. A lot of that was coming from Israel. Some of it was coming from Ukraine as well. So Georgia did have the choice not to go there. And so in that sense, I think it was avoidable in the way that it played itself out. Now, the other question, which we still don't know the answer to, was Russia set on war? And my answer to that would be that very clearly from 2006 onwards, there was a Russian contingency plan to go to war in Georgia to defend the de facto states. And then a situation became radicalized as a consequence of the actions in the early part of 2008. And we do know that there is a contingency plan, because there's a particular documentary that was put out about 2 years later from actually of somewhat obscure provenance about the Lost Day, talked about how the soldiers had an envelope in which they had instructions that if it comes to war, this is what you're supposed to do. So there was clearly a contingency plan on the part of the Russians there. And it's understandable that there should be, because there were Russian peacekeepers. There were Russian soldiers that were effectively tripwires in those particular places. So of course there was going to be a contingency plan to come and rescue them if they came under attack. The question was, did Russia have a policy of sort of maximum pressure and increasing that pressure on Georgia as a consequence of what had happened? And I think that the balance of thinking in that is they probably did, but I don't know for sure.
A lot of people now are saying, no matter what Saakashvili did, Russia was still going to start the war. So this idea of a contingency plan, which I know the US has like a million of them, it's very typical. But in general, this sort of like pattern of so-called like abuse, right, by Russia is being touted everywhere, where even the president who had said something different, Georgian president, has now confirmed that in that narrative. So this idea that no matter what Georgia could have done, Russia was going to attack because Russia is just like evil and horrible, and it just wants to like exploit everyone who's around it. And this has been a very dominant theme. And every time we have tried to bring up NATO and like other complexities, like there are actually other ethnic groups, it's like not so cut. They've been like, I'm sorry, but that's like Western splaining, like we know that Russia's bad. It's like you in the West. And of course, these are the liberals who say this here. And even though most Georgians would actually not agree with that at all, like ones who are not on Twitter, right? But this idea that we are not allowed to talk about NATO, we're not allowed to talk about a lot more the international side or the regional dynamics, that we only should focus on Russia as an aggressor, who's also like illogical, it seems like, just out to get its neighbors, And no matter what people say, it's this is the underlying discourse now.
Yeah, so that's what I was pushing back against in my book. That's the thin geopolitics, which wants to reduce everything to just the enemy. And so your explanation becomes this thin one. Well, of course, it was because of the plotting of the enemy. Now, what I would say to that is, let's take into consideration this, this history of territorial uncertainty and conflict over the borders that were bequeathed to Georgia by the Soviet Union. Let's talk about the legacy of that. Let's talk about the legacy of the violence and civil war and the disintegration of the state in the very early years, very important early years of Georgia as a post-Soviet state, because that legacy of violence lives on today. And the distrust that comes from that lives on today. This is not a Russia-only story. It cannot be a Russia-only story. Now, is Russia an imperialist power? I think, yes, that Russia is an imperialist power. Russia has aspirations to control the security environment beyond its borders. But you have to understand what being an imperialist power is here. From the inside, what that looks like as far as Russia is concerned is Russia has an obligation to smaller peoples to prevent them suffering genocide at the hands of ethno-nationalist, quote unquote, fascist forces. Now that's a particular discourse which we hear today, of course. But from their point of view, they are rescuing small nations that are at the mercy of these ethno-nationalist forces. And so that was their story with South Ossetia. They're coming in to rescue the Ossetians that are suffering genocide at the hands of the Georgian forces. They had a case. They had a case because in 1990, Skanvali was trashed by forces that by the National Guard, and it was besieged 3 times in the early part of the under the rule of Gamze Kurdia. So that history of violence, therefore, completely alienated Ossetians. And polarized South Ossetia. And, this was an area where there was lots of intermarriage and there were very, very good relations. But that history is really, really important. So what Russia did is take over a discourse which was already there in Ossetians, because Ossetia has their own nationalists, and their discourse was that there was a history of genocide against Ossetians within Georgia. Now, not all Ossetians bought into that discourse, because there's lots of Ossetians within Georgia itself, outside South Ossetia, but among the more hardline group within the Ossetians, the group that were behind the separatist state, that was their narrative. And that was the narrative that Russia took in 2008. So that's what how they've justified the intervention to themselves. There is this sort of rescue fantasy. What we're seeing in Ukraine right now is that it's sort of played out in a very, very different way. And I think that the Ukrainian conflict is quite different in its particulars, but the larger structural context is the same, which is it is a post-imperial context. But the imperial is complicated because the Soviet Union as an empire is a complicated thing. It's not quite an empire in the way as other empires are. And so we have to bring all of this to our minds when we try to think this through. And it's not easy. It's much easier to say, well, the Russians are to blame, the Russians are behind it. It's much easier to go with a conspiracy theory than it is to actually ask questions and try to do the hard work to figure out what happened and were there other paths? And there were other paths.
To come back to Saakashvili's decision, because you told that Saakashvili could avoid the war, something like, as I understood, he to avoid the war, he had not react in the way like he reacted, as you call it, as an emotional rationalist, like it was also emotionally directed response, because the Georgian soldiers died there in this small fight, maybe, but the Georgian soldiers died. But to the same time, you mentioned that there was a preparation for the war. I even can add that, for example, 1 year before or 2 years before, Georgian government established the special TV, military TV, in which this militaristic language was used and the pictures have been used. But anyway, I need the question. If you say that Saakashvili could avoid the war, what was the rationale behind Saakashvili's decision? It is one question. There's a second question. After the war 2008, we got the situation when the Russia became something like, or it was propagated and it was somehow supported, this idea, this discourse also, that Russia became something like creator of Saakashvili's modern Georgia. Do you know why? Because, if we see Saakashvili, he had no ideology at all. So he needed something like to unite the people, unite the Georgians, and the best way to unite them around some idea was this anti-Russian attitude. We had this anti-Russian attitude. I had very strong anti-Russian attitude also before, frankly speaking. But it was not such. It was not taken on political level. And after the war 2008, it has been taken on political level. It became something like ideology, And that's why I do think that this kind of argument could matter in this sense, because you told that war was avoidable from Saakashvili.
Yeah, so on the first question, what could Saakashvili have done differently, and why did he take the decision that he took? So I do think that there was a contingency plan to take Skandvali, to kind of loop around this city, connect with the Georgian communities to the north, and to seize the Gupta Bridge, and even potentially dynamite the Rocky Tunnel and prevent the Russian forces from coming in. That was enormous war optimism. But as we know, war optimism is something that happens to leaders, particularly those that are in super presidential systems, who believe that there's no checks on their power, and they get taken over with ideas of mission and providential destiny, that this is something that they're going to do. They're at the same time, they realized it was a gamble, and if Timuri Yakubashvili's quote is to be believed, when he said after the decision was made, and he was with Saakashvili at the time, he said, are we going to be Israelis or Palestinians? So there is a sense that, things were, they were gambling, they were rolling the dice, and they knew that. I also believe that Saakashvili thought that the US would be embarrassed into coming to the aid of Georgia. And he had good reason to believe that, because a lot of people were unrestrained in their support of Saakashvili. And, Matt Bryza was very close to Saakashvili. And, I interviewed him for the book, and he indicated that he was saying to the Georgians, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And even, he said, late at night when they would be in a restaurant and stuff like that, it almost became a joke where he would say, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. But what the point is here, that in one sense he's affirming that was the culture. The culture was, we're going to, look at this, we're going to do this. There's a sort of Caucasian masculinity. Maybe I'll let me qualify that. It's just simple hypermasculinity generally, not necessarily Caucasian. That we're going to demonstrate force. We're going to use this new equipment, this new kit, all of these tools, including attack helicopters and the like, and we're going to overawe the South Ossetians, and we're going to take back that particular territory before the Russians can do anything. And if the Russians come, then we will try to geopoliticize the heck out of it to prevent them gaining what we will have seized. So I think that's a theory there, and that's a conception. Now, in terms of Saakashvili nation building, well, early on, Saakashvili, I think at one point described himself as his aspiration was to be the Georgian Putin. And so what did he mean by that? Well, so he was going to be tough. He was going to be a territorial tough, in the same way Putin had prosecuted the war in Chechnya, and of course in a very, very brutal way. But he had therefore reestablished a power vertical within the state. And the question as to what the relationship of Russia was to be in that, Saakashvili says that he wanted Georgia to be Russia's best friend in the Caucasus. That was his pitch to Putin, but that, very quickly relations between the two men broke down. And Putin clearly, from what I can see, could not stand Saakashvili, could not stand him at all. In fairness to Putin, that's a reaction that a number of people have had to Saakashvili, because he's a very charismatic, powerful, overwhelming force of nature, and so you either like it or you don't, and Putin very clearly didn't. I think it was clear from the outset, however, that Saakashvili's ideology was going to be anti-Russian. He was someone who played to the old-style Gamza-Kurdia vision of Georgia, the spiritual Georgia, and that vision. And so that was really antithetical to Russia and all things Russian, and to the Soviet Union. I mean, the Soviet Union was something to be purged from Georgia and Georgian history. The Soviet Union was a mentality that had to be overcome. And so there was a civilizational quality to his discourse. And I think you've talked with Archil Sikharul-Idze about this. And that was a really good episode in which you kind of got at some of these issues. And so in that sense, Saakashvili is sort of representing a certain civilizational vision. And that civilizational vision has the West at the top and Russia's way, way down. in the civilizational hierarchy.
There's this debate about, did the United States or the West help enough or at all? What was their role? You already mentioned this interview with Matthew Bryza, and obviously there's some other research people have done where these top US officials saying, we warned Saakashvili, we warned that he was getting militaristic and had this sort of posture. But also there's people who sometimes will bring up this idea that the only reason that Russia did not actually come into Tbilisi was because they parked an airplane at the airport, and that there was a big ship that came into Batumi, and that these were actually, preventative measures, right? And then there's others who say, well, that's kind of actually nonsense. The United States was not something that deterred Russia, but in fact, they had a completely different calculation. This small detail ends up being very, very important in the contemporary political discourse of Georgia because of what is this role of the US and US's relation to Georgia and Georgia's relation to Russia.
There are incentives on many sides to inflate the significance of that moment. And that moment was one which needs to be contextualized, and it came after the invasion, after the Bush administration. Its initial response was criticized significantly from the right. The Wall Street Journal wrote a blistering op-ed against the Bush administration because Bush had been pictured earlier at the Olympics. You'll remember he was at the Olympics and actually discussed the crisis with Putin, famously at the Olympic Stadium. But then Bush was pictured later with the women's volleyball team, and the optics of that were criticized because it wasn't seemly. There's this desire on the part of the neoconservative right for a Churchill, that there's always has to be the man of destiny who stands before history and makes the decision and is tough and confronts the dictator and rallies the nation. And so they were in full Churchill mode, and George W. Bush was not delivering, so they blasted him using the Wall Street Journal opinion page, and the White House reacted to this quite strongly, and so they then engaged in this what was called a sort of Berlin airlift. Because that was the analogy that was used by the Wall Street Journal, is that we need a sort of Berlin airlift in order to protect little Georgia, who's suffering at the hands of the Russian imperial aggressor. So the US began to deliver aid. The Russians were very suspicious of this because they felt that the US was actually delivering arms. And here you have to commend the work of Admiral Mike Mullen from the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the US, who managed to get the Georgian soldiers back from Iraq, flying by with American planes into a war zone in order to get Georgian troops back on the ground. So that required considerable diplomacy and deconfliction of the airspace. But the incentive on the part of the neoconservatives is that Bush finally became Churchill, and as a consequence, Putin stood down. Now, that's a fantasy. The reason why Putin did not go all the way to Tbilisi and engage in a regime change, we'll have to wait for the archives to become available. Hopefully at some point they will become available so we can look at that decision in greater detail. But I think that the US's reaction was probably of little significance relative to the actual military challenge of going into Tbilisi and taking over Tbilisi. But I don't know for sure. But what I would say is that there is a sort of tendency, it's a sort of great power narcissism, is that the tendency of great powers to think that the decision that we made all the difference. But there are probably lots of other factors at play at that particular moment. And so we just don't know for sure. I think that Sarkozy takes credit for talking Putin down from his emotional reaction to the August War. And so if there is any sort of strong empirical case to be made that the actions of one Western leader did make a difference, that leader would be Sarkozy, President Sarkozy of France.
Yeah, that's actually what I remembered. So now, like listening to Condoleezza Rice and having these talking heads, they've totally rewritten that entire chapter as no, like, Saakashvili had nothing to do with it. Russia was, invaded Georgia, like, out of the blue. And just like that narrative, that critical, there was a moment where the West was very critical of that. Like, I heard the criticisms, that it was Misha's fault, or Misha at least aggravated and started the full scale escalation instead of the shellings and so on, the more local violence. So now it's like completely gone and everyone's like telling a different story that fits in with the Ukraine narrative. And like people who don't know anything about Georgia are writing to me from the US being like, oh, Putin also took over, invaded Georgia, just like they're doing Ukraine. And I'm like, it's a little different. Like it's, we have to go back and look at the, the differences between that. But that has been, MSNBC, everything has been playing it over and over again. That's what they do. And they keep showing all of a sudden Grozny, this idea that Ukraine is going to become Chechnya, that it's like this is a standard way of operating and so on. With that, also when we talk about, because I think the only way this can end is if there's concessions from the West at some level, but I don't know, it's hard because Putin is painted as an irrational actor. Maybe he's the Winston Churchill the right has been waiting for, the man of destiny, but he's painted as an irrational actor that no matter what you concede, he's just going to do it anyway, right? So like, what's the point of concessions? They're just going to like pummel, they keep getting, Ukraine to get pummeled because, well, it's like, what does Putin want? And it's like, he's clearly has stated what he wants. It's not like a big mystery here. They never talk about what he actually wants. It's this constant like, oh, he's just this irrational actor. We're all going to blow up soon. And with that, they're like, oh, what about the agency, right? And this is where like polling comes in. We have polls all the time. Do you want NATO? Do you want NATO? And it's like this very prescriptive polling to get a certain kind of tendency, right? Because I think most Georgians would actually hope to have good relationships with everybody. They don't want to pick sides. I think that's actually, I would say, the Georgian position, besides a very radicalized view. But this idea of local agency, going back to that, and being then buttressed by these pollings. See, this is what people want. And then this idea of when did this whole like NATO talk begin, where all these polling places were giving money to do these like polls to get the, pro-West sort of things, started. And in a way, I feel like it's a little bit cooked, because they specifically target certain, they control the NGOs, they control the narrative, they control the questions, they ask the same things, they don't ask certain things. I mean, it's so cooked, if this was Russia doing it, we'd be calling it Russian propaganda, but it's the West doing it, so there is no propaganda. But this idea of local agency has been constantly used as this we are somehow excluding what Georgia wants, even though I think a lot of people are never even given this idea of Georgians don't even know even about the conflicts. Like when you're talking right now, like you don't really hear any of these discussions in any media. It's always like we're the good guys and that's it. And only they kill Georgians. Only Ossetians do borderization. The only Ossetians kidnap. Only Ossetians do these things. There's never mentioned ever that something else might exist. So in a way that we keep saying, oh, what about our agency? We have completely taken away Ossetian agency and we just say, oh, they're just puppets of Russia. We can't talk to them. So there's like all these dynamics happening with the same weapon as being so-called used, they're saying being used against Georgia, then being applied to Ossetia.
I will continue Sopo's idea, but a little bit different way. I will cope with this question. So, it's like how it is in Georgia. What Sopo is saying, I totally agree with. It is not a Georgian attitude, but it's an attitude from all small countries that they try to have with all of. It's rational for them to have to not only around, but with all of countries a good relation, of course, because it is useful for them, and this is rational, of course. But what kind of problem we have? We see, for example, in case of NATO, and I compare NATO with the market. For example, in Georgia, market is not understood as a way of economy, like to make the economy to maintain the economy, to way to produce something or to sell something. But market is a vision. Market is a less research. Market is a, how can I express it? Market it's not the mean, but market is a goal. And the same is with the NATO. NATO is why we do why NATO is necessary. NATO is necessary to have the security. But if NATO, it can have also theoretically security without the NATO if you have no hostile relation with your neighbors, or if the balance of power is created in the way that you get this security. Because of balance of power, because of rule-based international relation, and so on. But in this propaganda, NATO became the goal, not the mean of the security. No, what I mean? Like in the economy, market is not the mean of production and the economy, but the goal.
Yeah, from the perspective of an outsider, when I studied the history of the territorial conflicts in Georgia, there are two tragedies that I see. One is the assertion of absolute victimhood, privileged victimhood over all others. So the tragedy there is the inability to recognize the victimhood of others, and that you're involved in that, and that there's a process of violence, a process of insecurity, which led to a process of violence, and therefore that has resulted in alienation, polarization, and very, very difficult legacies, which only patient peacekeeping or peace building can overcome. And that's hard work. It's easy to destroy a country. It's very, very hard to rebuild it. So that's the first tragedy, is that South Ossetians or Ossetians see themselves as a victim of an empire, and that empire is Georgia and its particular imperial aspirations to control South Ossetia, irrespective of what Ossetians think. The ethnic Abkhaz are the same. Of course, Georgia sees itself as a victim of imperial power. That imperial power is Russia, and they have a history of kind of a fraught, entangled history with Russia. But for the sort of ethno-nationalist entrepreneurs who were very, very crucial in the early stages of Georgian independence, they chose to define Georgia in a way that made it very difficult to create a multi-ethnic state, a state which is going to work for all of the people and be responsive to the interests of all of the residents that found themselves in Soviet Georgia as it became independent. Now, that was extremely difficult, but there were ways in which you could have recognized, expanded the domain of empathy for the experience and history of others. That's the first tragedy. The second tragedy is geopoliticization, and that is that each of these stakeholders are appealing to a higher power, to a patron, and they have an incentive to scale up their particular crisis. So it's not simply an issue of South Ossetia, it's an issue of Georgia and Russian relations, and it's even an issue of the history of the Cold War and the great power struggle between the United States and Russia. That geopoliticization inevitably has hurt all around. It's hurt all of the parties. Everyone loses from that because you polarize. And you get a situation where Georgia is now very, very unlikely to ever acquire the territorial integrity that it aspires to, because the situation is so far gone in Abkhazia and in South Ossetia. No matter if Putin was to be replaced, I would have severe questions as to whether a new leader would allow Georgia to renegotiate with South Ossetia and Abkhazia in a way that was very favorable to Tbilisi. Of course, that may be a question that's on the agenda, but the geopoliticization is the Saakashvili government. It was begun under Shevardnadze, but Saakashvili saw it as a way for him to wrap his agenda in the NATO flag, but that therefore meant that his government was seen as a conspiracy against Russia. And that initial support that he got from Russia to take over Ajara disappeared when he went all out crusading for NATO membership. That was a choice. Didn't have to make that choice. There was a choice to sort of restrain, to retreat from that which you desire in order to get it in the long run. And that sort of Zen approach is something that we just didn't see. And as a consequence, the people that are alive today are living in the world created by that polarization and those bad decisions.
I a little bit disagree with the argument that Russia backed Saakashvili with a reunification of Ajara, because Ajara was not a problem in the extent like South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Ajarians have no different identity like another Georgians. They are part of Georgian, like the Imereti, Mingrelia, and so on and so on. This was just maybe Russia supported more to Aslan Abashidze's Georgia, because otherwise, I don't know how this situation will end up. At the end of the day, if Russia will not pursue Aslan Abashidze to leave Georgia.
On that point, Becca, here's the argument I'm making. It's not an argument about Adjara and its sort of ethnic composition, distinctive as it is as a place. It's more a case of Russia deciding not to instrumentalize it for its own purposes, to not make it into a territorial lever for Russian geopolitical ends in the South Caucasus. And then that, again, a decision. You are dealing with a situation where initially Russia was on the same page as Georgia. Abkhazia, South Ossetia are part of the territory of Georgia. The Russian government agrees with that. And now we're in a situation where the world is very, very different. And, you have this very, very toxic legacies that are going to be extremely difficult to be unwound. And you have a Georgian population that sees all of these issues in a geopolitical lens, rather than looking at, as you pointed out, the local actors and the possibilities for diplomacy and an effort to try to de-geopoliticize this. So borderization becomes this sort of geopolitical crime, and it's a one-sided thing, and it is another way in which Georgia can demonstrate its victimhood to NATO and to the West. But I just wonder if there is a way in which, the current government is trying to do that, in a way in which turning down the geopoliticization and trying to rethink the ways in which these things are framed is going to yield very greater results. It may not, but it is something that lies in the hands of Georgians. There is a capacity for agency. There's a capacity for restraint as much as sort of amplification and intensification of polarization.
Benevolence.